The morning sun spilled across the glass towers, painting the city in gold. But inside her chest, it felt like rain. She stood before the grand doors of that downtown bank, clutching a worn folder that held every dream she'd fought for. The security guard barely nodded as she entered, and her heels clicked against the marble floor like nervous heartbeats. People in tailored suits glanced her way, their smiles tight, their eyes brief. She had walked through rooms like this before, places where politeness hides disbelief. She rehearsed her words silently. Numbers, plans, fate. But when the teller looked at her, that look told a story older than her name. A story of how some are seen as risk before they're ever seen as human. Yet, even as her breath trembled, something in her gaze stayed firm. Underdog zeros stayed firm, because hope, she knew, wasn't a loan to be approved. It was already hers. Outside, the city hummed like it didn't care who won or lost inside those walls. She stood still for a moment, holding back the sting in her eyes. The rejection wasn't new. It just hit harder when you'd done everything right. She looked at the folder, the papers she'd stayed up nights to perfect. Somewhere between her hard work and their cold words, something broke quietly. But as her daughter ran up to her, smiling like sunlight, she remembered who she was fighting for. They rode the bus home in silence. The city passed by in reflections, tall buildings giving way to cracked sidewalks and corner stores. She held her daughter's hand, feeling small fingers squeeze hers in comfort. For years, she'd told herself hard work was the answer. But maybe it wasn't just about effort. Maybe it was about doors, and who was allowed to walk through them. At home, the smell of flour and sugar lingered from the morning. Her kitchen wasn't big, but it was alive. Warm light, laughter, and dreams baked into every corner. She unpacked her folder, smoothing the crumpled pages. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from defeat, from determination. She whispered to herself, "Maybe they said no. But that doesn't mean it's over." Later that night, she sat by the window, city lights flickering in the distance. The rejection replayed in her mind, but so did something deeper. A quiet fire that told her not to bend. Because people like her weren't waiting for permission anymore. They were building their own doors, one dream at a time. The next morning, she walked the same street again, not to beg, but to breathe. The sting of rejection had faded into a strange calm. Sometimes silence after pain feels almost holy. She passed by the bank doors, pretending not to look, but her reflection caught her anyway. Just then, a sleek black car pulled up. The man who stepped out moved like someone who didn't need to prove anything. His presence shifted the air, and fate, it seemed, was about to shift with it. Inside the bank, whispers filled the marble lobby. The manager straightened his tie as the man entered. Marcus Reed, the one name whispered in real estate circles like a quiet legend. He owned more than properties. He owned silence in rooms like this. And when he asked for the manager, the shift in tone was instant. That blend of fear and flattery that only power could summon. She turned slightly as the man greeted the manager. His voice carried weight without raising, smooth, certain, like someone used to decisions that shaped skylines. But then his eyes met hers, and something familiar flickered there. He paused, recognizing her face from months ago, the baker who'd delivered pastries to his office, the woman who refused pity and served pride with every slice. The connection hung between them like a quiet miracle. The air shifted. Marcus asked the manager calmly, who had been turned away that morning. John stammered, words tumbling over themselves. When Marcus learned it was her, a slow silence filled the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said, "She's my business partner." The room froze. The teller looked down, the manager's smile cracked. And Ava? She just stood there, still as light, her heart catching up with the moment that changed everything. She didn't say a word. Some moments don't need sound to speak. The same man who'd rejected her now stumbled over apologies, but her silence carried more power than his titles ever could. Marcus glanced her way, giving a nod that said, "You don't have to prove yourself anymore." Outside, the city kept moving, but inside that room, history quietly bent in her favor. The story spread quietly, carried on whispers through marble halls and glass corridors. Some said the manager turned pale when he realized whose signature was on the deed of the building. Others said he tried to make amends, offering meetings and apologies wrapped in artificial smiles, but she never looked back. Ava didn't need their approval anymore. She had already found her validation in the truth that no one could erase. That power, real power, often wears humility as its crown. That evening, she sat with Marcus at a small cafe across the street. He talked about business, she talked about dreams, and somewhere between the two, a partnership was born from shared respect. He didn't see her as a charity case. He saw her as what she'd always been. Capable. As they clinked coffee cups, laughter replaced the weight of yesterday's shame. The world outside was still unjust, but for the first time it didn't feel unbeatable. Back home, she spread her plans across the kitchen table again. The same sheets that had been dismissed now gleamed with new promise. Marcus had offered to back her bakery expansion, not out of pity, but because he saw something real. As her daughter helped tape sketches to the wall, the space filled with purpose. Each number, each drawing felt like a quiet act of rebellion, a declaration that dreams don't need permission slips. Weeks passed, filled with construction dust, late nights, and endless calls, but exhaustion had never felt so alive. Her bakery, the one they said she couldn't build, was taking shape. She could already smell the cinnamon and sugar that would fill its air. Standing among the unfinished walls, she ran her hand along the counter's edge, imagining laughter, music, and morning crowds. This wasn't just a business. It was her answer to every no she'd ever heard. Nay, when the first sign went up, Brooks and Reed Bakery, she stood on the sidewalk and let herself breathe. The same street that had once watched her leave in defeat now held her victory in its light. She smiled at the reflection in the window, at the woman who refused to shrink. Across the street, the bank's glass facade glimmered back, silent and small. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it rises, soft, sweet, and undeniable. The scent of fresh bread and sugar spilled into the street before dawn. Her bakery's first morning felt like a sunrise she had waited a lifetime for. The lights glowed warm, the counters gleamed, and the soft hum of music wrapped around her like a blessing. People began to line up outside, drawn by the smell, by curiosity, by something that felt like hope. For years she'd been told what she couldn't do. But here she was, doors open, ovens ready, heart steady, proving that resilience has its own recipe. By mid-morning, laughter filled the space. Customers of every kind, neighbors, workers, strangers, came through the doors not knowing the story behind the sweetness they tasted. Across the street, through the glass, the bank manager watched. Maybe it was guilt, maybe admiration. Either way, he couldn't look away. Some lessons don't come through words. They arrive baked in humility and grace. He finally came in that afternoon, awkward, hesitant, holding a small bouquet like a peace offering. She could have turned him away, but she didn't. She greeted him with the same grace she carried through every storm. He ordered coffee and a pastry, his voice trembling slightly. Maybe he thought forgiveness was owed to him. But she didn't do it for him. She did it for herself. Because carrying bitterness was too heavy for a woman already flying. Later that week, the bakery became more than a business. It became a heartbeat for the neighborhood. A place where people lingered, where stories met over coffee, where dreams felt possible again. She started teaching free, baking lessons on Sundays, not for profit, but for pride. To show young girls that success could look like them too. And each time she saw their eyes light up, she remembered that power multiplies when shared. That evening, as the last customers left and the lights dimmed, she stood by the window once more. The same street that had once carried her heartbreak now carried her legacy. She watched her daughter sweep the floor, humming softly, unaware that her mother had changed the rhythm of their story forever. Ava smiled, not the kind born from victory, but the quiet kind born from peace, the kind that whispers you did it, and you did it with grace. Months passed, and the bakery thrived like a living heartbeat in the center of the block. Every morning, lines stretched down the sidewalk, filled with laughter, stories, and the smell of cinnamon. But success didn't change her. It deepened her calm. She had learned that winning quietly still shakes the world. The same people who once looked through her now looked up to her. And though she never sought revenge, she found redemption baked into every loaf she sold. One afternoon, the local news arrived. They wanted to feature her story. The woman who turned rejection into a revolution. She hesitated at first, shy of the spotlight. But when she saw her daughter's proud smile, she agreed. Cameras rolled as she spoke about faith, hard work, and grace under fire. She didn't mention the bank. She didn't need to. The story wasn't about who had tried to stop her. It was about who she refused to stop being. That evening, she walked outside after closing and looked across the street. The bank stood silent, its windows dark, except for one glowing office. Inside, the manager sat alone, staring at papers on his desk. She didn't feel anger anymore, only a calm kind of closure. Sometimes life doesn't need grand apologies. Sometimes justice is as simple as existing where you were never meant to belong, and doing it beautifully. The next morning, she found a letter slipped under the bakery door. No name, just a typed note that said, "Thank you for showing me who I was." She knew who it came from. She folded it neatly, tucked it into her recipe book, and smiled. Because sometimes change doesn't happen in the streets or through headlines. Sometimes it begins quietly, in one heart realizing it's never too late to be better. Later that day, she walked hand in hand with her daughter down the same street where everything began. The bank's mirrored walls reflected them as they passed, 2 generations carrying the strength of one journey. Her daughter looked up and asked softly, "Mama, how did you stay kind?" Ava smiled, brushing her hand over her child's hair. "Because kindness," she said, "was the one thing they couldn't take from me." The wind lifted her words like a prayer, and the city for once felt like it was listening. Time moved gently, like sugar dissolving in tea. Her bakery was no longer just a shop. It had become a sanctuary. People came for bread, but they stayed for something deeper. Warmth, belonging, the quiet reminder that they mattered. She had hired 3 young women from the neighborhood, teaching them how to balance ledgers, bake bread, and build courage. Each of them carried their own stories of struggle, but in this space they weren't stories of pain anymore. They were proof of what survival could look like when given light. Her story began to ripple through the city. Articles, interviews, even business schools wanted to feature her journey. Yet she stayed grounded, reminding everyone that her real success wasn't numbers on a screen, but faces that smiled across her counter. She spoke at local schools, telling children that dreams don't always need permission slips, only persistence. And when she saw their eyes shine, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom, not from struggle, but from doubt. Weeks later, she stood on a new construction site, the future home of her second bakery. It was surreal to think that the same city that once shut its doors on her was now opening new ones. The air smelled of sawdust and new beginnings. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the wind against her skin, and whispered a thank you. Not to luck, but to every closed door that had pushed her toward her own. That night, back at home, she baked quietly. Not for business, but for herself. The kitchen was filled with the sound of her daughter's laughter, the hum of the oven, and gospel music playing softly on the radio. She realized that success hadn't changed her rhythm. It had simply tuned it. She moved with peace now, not striving but flowing, not chasing but becoming. Every breath carried gratitude. Every crumb held history. Later that evening, she sat on the porch, tea in hand, watching the stars blink awake above the city skyline. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of bread from her bakery a few blocks away. She thought of all the versions of herself, the one who'd been dismissed, the one who'd fought quietly, the one who finally stood tall. They were all still here, resting together inside her peace. Some stories don't need applause. They just need to be lived. Beautifully. Fully. Unapologetically. The city had changed, or maybe it was her eyes that saw it differently now. Her bakery had become a landmark, not just for food, but for faith and possibility. People came from far away to meet the woman whose no became everyone's yes. The mayor's office called, asking her to speak at a city event about local entrepreneurship. Standing on that stage days later, she realized her voice carried more than words. It carried generations of prayers that had been waiting for this sound. She didn't talk about numbers or profits that day. She talked about moments, the way fear can teach faith, how rejection can carve strength. She spoke softly, but every word landed heavy, even among the noise of the city. And when she looked at her daughter in the crowd, smiling so proudly, it hurt to look too long. She felt her heart ache in the sweetest way. She realized this wasn't just her story anymore. It was a seed already growing in others. After the event, she walked home slowly, letting the cheers fade behind her. The same bank still stood tall across from her bakery, but she no longer saw it as a symbol of pain. It was just another building now. Stone, glass, and memory. Her bakery across the street gleamed like it always did, filled with laughter and light. Some battles aren't won by fighting harder. They're won by outlasting the doubt. Later that night, as her bakery closed and laughter faded into quiet, Marcus joined her by the counter. He told her he was proud, not just of what she'd built, but how she built it. She smiled, brushing sugar from her hands, telling him she couldn't have done it without his faith. He shook his head and said softly, "You had the faith. I just made sure the world saw it." The words settled between them like sunlight in an empty room. Warm, gentle, eternal. The next morning, sunlight streamed through her window, soft and golden. She woke early, just as she had on that first day, and sat by the edge of her bed for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the city. Her daughter still slept, her breathing steady, her future wide opened. She smiled to herself, whispering a prayer of thanks. Not for the bakery or the success, but for the journey that had tried to break her and instead built her into something unshakable. When she finally stood, she walked toward the window and opened it wide, letting the light in.